this, but I have very bad internet connection today. So if I drop off, Arnold will share, and Carlos is here also to take care of the technicalities that I otherwise normally take care of. So,
Radhika,
okay,
excuse
with
me.
that, yes. Yes,
Uh,
Arnold?
I just spoke to Diego. He's in the process of joining.
Okay, great. Brilliant. So, okay, folks, we have nearly everybody here, and certainly all the speakers are here, and great to have a very good audience today. Hello, my name is Radhika Desai. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, and this, of course, is the latest of the webinars organized by the IMG. As many of you know, the International Manifesto Group regularly discusses the fast-changing political and geopolitical economy of our times. It has members from around the world and a manifesto entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. We are basically believe that we believe in a kind of an anti-imperialist socialism, of course, an anti-imperialist and sustainable socialism. You can read our manifesto at www.internationalmanifesto.org, and there you can also read the manifesto in various languages. You can consider signing it, volunteering with us, and donating. The last is important. We don't need much money, but we need a little bit. So whatever you can give to keep our operations going is really appreciated. And finally, please also tell your like-minded friends about us and about our webinars so that we can expand the reach of these ideas that I'm sure you all share with us. Our title today is Maduro-led Forces Sweep Venezuelan Elections while US is silent. Notwithstanding US and Western allegations that the Bolivarian government is authoritarian, an overwhelming majority of the dozens of elections held in that country over the past quarter century have constituted an endorsement of the Bolivarian governments. This is also the case with the most recent, held on the 25th of May, 2025. These were parliamentary and regional elections for 285 National Assembly deputies, 24 state governors, and 260 regional legislators. The Bolivarian Alliance won 253 of the 285 seats in parliament and all but one of the governorships. And we are told that the Bolivarian forces are heading for an overwhelming victory with 82% of the votes. Of course, Western media, despite these overwhelming results, has continued to gripe about the problems of democracy in Venezuela. It is claimed that turnout was low. In fact, despite the inevitable damage that US and Western illegal sanctions have caused to the government's legitimacy, despite considerable outmigration, despite boycotts by sections of the opposition, turnout was no lower than normal for a non-presidential elections, no lower than a US midterm congressional election. And the Bolivarian government still won 1.3 million more votes than it had before. The Western media also claimed that the opposition was marginalized. If so, it was its own doing. The opposition was divided as never before between those boycotting and those participating in the elections, the latter thanks in no small part to the efforts of the Maduro government to reconcile the opposition, not the act of an authoritarian government. While such attempts at discrediting Venezuelan democracy are routine, one major element of the post-election scene is not, as Arnold August, who first proposed this webinar, will be speaking shortly, has been insisting. It is very interesting to note that the US government which normally goes on the offensive about democracy in Venezuela after every election, and whose so-called support for democracy is in fact support for authoritarian governments in opposition to democracy. This is the real imperial reality behind the US and the West pretends to favor democracy. And you know, we should underline this just in case the carnage in Gaza has not already made this abundantly clear. But this US government, which normally goes on the offensive, has been strangely silent. Why might this be? Well, it seems to me that a number of things are going wrong with their usual anti-democratic game, whose ultimate game, of course, is to get their dirty hands on Venezuela's huge oil reserves and other resources, and to discredit Venezuelan socialism, which still remains something of a beacon to the rest of Latin America and to the world. However, the achievement of the US's aims, the West's aims, has been successfully thwarted by the Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution for a quarter century. And these attempts may finally be going into reverse. What are the chief signs? Well, there is, of course, the triumphant victory of the Bolivarian forces, notwithstanding intensified promotion of the opposition by the United States. There is the recent exposure of massive US aid to elements of the same opposition. There is the fact that the opposition is now divided over participation, while the Machado faction calls for the forcible overthrow of the Bolivarian government through US military intervention. Two major opposition leaders and former presidential candidates, Enrique Capriles and Henri Falcon, have been elected to parliament. There is also the need, of course, for the United States to step up Venezuelan oil production in order to keep oil prices low and conversely the dollar high. A need that was evidenced by the Biden administration's attempt to negotiate with the Maduro government, which seemed to come otherwise completely out of the blue. There is also the fact that Corina Machado, the opposition leader, openly sympathized with the Trump administration's illegal and brutal deportation of Venezuelans to be thrown into an El Salvadorian prison of ill repute. And there is the simple fact that even the opposition now upholds Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo, which has recently become moot thanks to the discovery of oil and gas, which, of course, the United States has been disputing. Undoubtedly, there are other factors which, of course, our speakers will refer to. So, what is the reality on the ground? How has the Bolivarian government held its own against the capricious, illegal, and murderous sanctions of the US and the West? What is the mood of the people amid all the difficulties they cause? What are the prospects for the future? With us to discuss all of these are 7 observers of the recent elections. As you know, Venezuela tends to invite a lot of foreign observers, and there were hundreds of them this time. So these 7 people were on the ground as the democratic exercise was held. So we've invited them to speak to us. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will have questions time for questions and answers. And we hope that we will be able to finish all this by the 2-hour mark. I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn. Our first speaker is Arnold August, and Arnold is an independent writer and journalist, and many of you will have read his work not only on Cuba and Venezuela, but also on Iran and many other important trouble spots around the world. So Arnold, please go ahead. The floor is yours. Arnold, you are still muted.
Thank you very much, Radhika. I will deal with 3 points, all within 10 minutes. Firstly, there's general consensus amongst those of us who support the Bolivarian Revolution that the May 25 elections was a success. However, why? What are the explanations? Well, I would like to go on the limb and give my take. At the same time, I would love to hear the views, the input of other panelists, especially those who are there not only for the elections, but who live in Venezuela. This is my take. Before leaving for I think it was my 6th or 7th trip to Venezuela, I researched what Chavez had to say about elections. And he pointed out, I think is a very important point, that it is important during the elections that the Bolivarian Revolution, the leadership, in addition to mass concentrations, mass gatherings, also try to deal with the undecided voters, those who may not be Chavista but have not decided how to vote in, for example, door-to-door work. Now, in my view, this is perhaps what happened. When I was in just the day before the elections in one of the neighborhoods I visited, the 23 de Enero, very iconic Chavista stronghold. I asked some of the militants there off the record because it's a very, sensitive issue. And at least one of them agreed that yes, in fact, this time around, they are dealing with more door-to-door work in addition to the mass concentrations. Now, during the evening of the elections, at least one leader of the PSUV mentioned that one of the reasons for the victory was that they are decided to strengthen the normal participatory protagonistic democracy by increasing the door-to-door work to deal with undecided voters. So that's my view. This is perhaps an explanation, but I'd love to hear from those who are on the ground, especially those who live there. The second point I would like to deal with is share my experience in two barrios that I visit the day before the election. One is Petare. Petare is very important. It's one of the, it is the, in fact the just close to Caracas. It is the known as the biggest barrio or the biggest slum in as used in a slang way, in Latin America with over 350,000 people there. Now, Petare was important. I'm glad that I visited that place because in the last elections, for the presidential election, we recall that there was a certain amount of violent activities carried out against the Bolivarian revolutions, its symbols, even health clinics. Now, one of the sources of these destabilizing factors was Petare. It is known as quite a violent neighborhood. So, but when I went there the day before the election, it was very clear in exchanging with the people there of all persuasions that the Chavista seems to have taken control of the situation. There was no indication of any antagonistic attitude on the part of the voters there against the Maduro government. Now, I think that, Petare is important, and the same thing was in 23 de Enero. I visited that iconic stronghold of Chavismo the day before the elections and was very clear how the vote was going to take place there. And so I think, any indication that there was fraud or all that, but my on-the-ground contact with the people, speaking to them, was that atmosphere that I saw locally was reflected in the vote. Now, on the issue of the why United States is silent. Well, what I did just before, in preparing for today, I scoured uh, uh, the entire email or the entire Twitter feed of Richard Grenell. We will recall we discussed that in the last webinar that Richard Grenell was Trump's point man to go to Maduro, actually meet him, shake hands with him in order to liberate 6 hostages. Of course, he tweeted about that, the 6 hostages as a victory. But since then, I scoured his entire Twitter feed. He made no mention at all about the elections that took place on May 25th. In addition, Marco Rubio, who was the Secretary of State, he only mentioned it once in the context of the hostages coming back and remarked that Maduro was an illegitimate government, but nothing at all since then. And the Bureau of Western Hemisphere mentioned the elections on May 25th, but only with regard, their only concern seemed to be the elections in the Essequibo area, which is oil rich. That is all. So while all of these Twitter feeds deals with all of the Trump talking points, whether it's a domestic, immigration, Iran, Palestine, China, whatever, everything is the same except in Venezuela. So why? I'm not too sure why. I guess it is as a result of the Trump's interest in the oil in Venezuela. But I think, for example, Mission Verdad, who has done a lot of work, investigation on the issue of Chevron and oil, perhaps if it's not in his prepared remarks, perhaps in discussion period, they can go into that, the Trump's interest in the oil and how that may affect the moderate stance by not taking a stand against the results of the elections. And those are the 3 points that I want to deal with. I think I dealt with it within the 10 minutes. If it's less than 10 minutes, that's great. We have more time for question and answer period.
Excellent, Arnold. Thank you very much. It was definitely less than 10 minutes, so super disciplined there. Our next speaker is Sira Pascual Marquina. She's a popular educator and she's with Pluriversidad and El Panal Commune in Caracas. So it's really great to have you, Sira, here as you are actually on the ground there in Caracas. Please go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this space to the International Manifesto Group. And I actually wanted to talk about Venezuela's democracy with a wider perspective after the elections that we just had and the elections that we are coming up. And since the issue of Venezuela for all those who are anti-imperialist and socialist is always on the table, I think it is important to reflect on really the content of Venezuela's democracy, which I actually think, because Venezuela's democracy is a sovereign democracy, is a project built by the people themselves. And that is one of the main key issues why U.S. imperialism goes against Venezuela with unilateral coercive measures. So everybody has heard it. In the Venezuelan constitution, it says that Venezuela's democracy is a participative and protagonic democracy. What does this actually mean? This actually means that we do have, let's say, conventional elections like we had on the 25th and like the ones we are going to have at the end of July. But it actually means too, and this is very important, that our democracy is not a restricted democracy. From my perspective, Occidental liberal democracy, however we want to call it, bourgeois democracy, is actually a tremendously restricted democracy. In fact, we could even say that it is oftentimes a democracy that just covers up the interests, but essentially ends up representing the interests of the elites of the bourgeoisie. So what is participative and protagonic democracy? Well, it actually goes back to 1991, 1992, when Chavez wrote the book when Chavez wrote a book that's called El Libro Azul, the Blue Book. I recommend that everybody read it. In this book, he basically examines the state of Venezuela's so-called democracy at that time, analyzing that indeed it was a very restricted democracy, a democracy that did not allow for the actual plurality and the radical intents of an important sector of the Venezuelan society in terms of building a just society. So we are already talking about 1991, but of course in the Constitutional Assembly, that's the first moment, we are talking about 1999, the Constitutional Assembly, when the people of Venezuela made their own democracy. That is another exercise in substantive democracy. And this is a term that I am going to use because we can say participative and protagonic democracy, but I like to use a term that is oftentimes used by Marxists, substantive democracy, that basically puts the content back into the idea of democracy. As we know, as Alicia said, actually the US calls itself the country that promotes democracy, and they go in one war after another, killing people, killing millions of people in the name of democracy, which is really not at all democratic. So we have these periods, but we also have, and I think I want to end up talking about a little bit about the commune, because I think it is the fullest expression of the profound substantive democracy that we have in Venezuela. As I said, we have conventional processes of democracy, like the one that we had on the 25th, like the one we will have in a month. But we have these other expressions of democracy that go to the grassroots. So expressions of popular democracy where you don't only choose a representative every 2, 4, 6 years. You, in conventional liberal democracies, you choose who will represent you, as Engels said, to in truth represent the interests of the minority, of the bourgeoisie. So our democracy is much more rich, a much richer democracy. Beginning in the very early days of the Bolivarian process, there were exercises of substantive grassroots assembly-based democracy, such as the tables for water, land use the spaces, and all these spaces were actually grassroots spaces where people democratically in assemblies without representatives, decided how to solve their problems. This escalated virtuously towards the communal councils in 2006. And the communal councils are territorial spaces where the people in a barrio, in a neighborhood, in the campo, in the countryside, decide, reflect, deliberate on what their major problems are, and look for ways to solve them. And look for ways to solve them hand in hand with the government and the state, because Bolivarian democracy, sometimes when we talk about it quickly, it may seem like an anarchistic project because it's just people solving their problems on their own. But no, it's not about people solving problems on their own. It is about people solving problems on their own, hand in hand with the government that is committed to the collective emancipation of the Venezuelan people. So 2006, the Communal Council, and 2009 is a very interesting year for us, a very important year for us. I am part of a commune and I am a communard. So 2009 is a very important year because that's when Chavez begins to talk about the communes. And the communes are profoundly democratic spaces, not only because, as in the Communal Council, people in assemblies decide what their problems are and with the government look about how to solve them, but communes are truly the pathway towards Bolivarian socialism, 21st century socialism. You may remember that in 2005, 2006, Chavez was already talking about Socialismo del siglo XXI, 21st century socialism. But of course, it is one thing to promote an objective, and it is another very different thing to actually build a roadmap to in terms of how to achieve that objective. And the commune is in fact the roadmap to Venezuela's socialism. Why? As I was saying, one, there is assembly, but two, and this is very, very important, I often say that Venezuela's communes and Venezuela's participative and protagonic democracy as we know it today walks on two legs, is that communes should have the means of production, and the type of property in communes is communal, direct social property. And what does that actually mean? That in the communes that are privileged to have a means of production, and I should say that not all communes have means of production, but the communes that have means of production, the property is collective. That means that it is, of course, not private property. It is not state property. It is not cooperative property. It is the property of the whole of the community. What is built in Las Abejitas del Panal, which is a means of production in my commune, that what happens with the surplus is decided collectively in the assembly by the neighbors, by the communards of the community. So we are talking about a substantive democracy that does not only have expressions of formal traditional democracy, that does not only have expressions of assembly-based decision-taking to solve problems, but that also has it should have, eventually, we are in a transition, it should have the control of the economy. Of course, we live generally speaking, we live in a capitalist world, and the exploitation of workers means that actually workers do not have a say in terms of what happens with their surplus. Of course, they are exploited, and that does not happen in that. It is an objective to overcome that in socialism, and that does not happen in communist exploitation. Through the means of production, communards have this control of the economic spaces within the commune. So I think that these things are very important when we think about, and I will ask, because I am actually not keeping track of my time, for someone to give me a sign if I should be wrapping up. But I wanted to bring up because as we are actually, oftentimes, I have 2 more minutes, great. As it is true that we have many, we could say, conventional electoral processes in Venezuela, more than 34 since the beginning of the Bolivarian process, which is frankly sometimes taxing, but it is necessary. Since we have this reality, it oftentimes gets related, the story of Venezuela's democracy. Well, of course, we know how the how the enemy represents it. But even within the ranks of those who are solidarians of the anti-imperialists, who are solidarians with the Bolivarian revolution, with this sovereign project that looks towards socialism, with this anti-imperialist project that looks to build a sovereign society, our democracy oftentimes gets represented just on the basis of this electoral process. And I think it's very, very, very important for people who are solidarians with our revolution to understand that, yes, those moments are important, but actually what happens in the communes, in the popular consultations, which are an initiative that the government began a little bit over a year ago, in which people, again, in the communes and in the communal circuits, meet in assemblies, decide what their main projects are. Then they actually get the resources from the government, and they vote on the projects, and they themselves execute the project. So these are exercises of direct participation from the beginning to the end. So I just wanted to say, and I will wrap it up here, that when folks think about our democracy, please do not just think about these electoral processes, which we have to talk about, but also let's think about the profound substantive democracy that we are building. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
That was really great, Sira, and I'm sure that somebody's going to ask you in the Q&A exactly how do you see the relation between the substantive democracy and electoral democracy, particularly the exercise we last had. But we will leave that for later. Our next speaker is Jesus Rodriguez. He is the editor of the well-known left-wing and Bolivarian outlet Orinoco Tribune. So, Jesus, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. I'm gonna share my screen. Just give me 1 second to do it. Do you see the slideshow that I have there?
Yeah, it's just appearing now, and you may want to
Okay.
go. Yeah, perfect.
That's great. That's great. This is like the summary of what I want to talk about today. I believe that I'm going to skip several parts that Radhika already mentioned in her very comprehensive introduction. But I believe that it's important to highlight the international scenario in which the election happened. I'm talking about the parliamentary and governor election. I mean, it was marked by an stagnated regional leftist movement. It's important to talk about that. And when I say regional, I'm talking about Latin America. A regional and an international rise of fascism that is important also to highlight, and that take us to the extremely terrible situation in the Middle East, with Israel becoming something very similar to what Germany was during Hitler's time. The strengthening of Venezuela's relations with China, Russia, India, Vietnam, which is also important, especially taking into consideration that we are facing also a strengthening in the U.S. siege against Venezuela, especially with Marco Rubio as head of the Department of State. And also terrorist plots that come mostly from abroad, especially from the U.S., that were unveiled or dismantled just days before this last election. So that's the international context that we were facing. And in terms of the status of the far-right opposition, I believe that it's important to talk about the division between Un Nuevo Tiempo, the division in the opposition with the appearance of this alliance of Un Nuevo Tiempo, which is the party for the ex-governor of Zulia State, Manuel Rosales, and Unidad y Cambio, which is a new party. It's like a division in Primero Justicia party that is now led by Capriles Radonsky. And Radhika mentioned it at the beginning when she said that there were opposition leaders, right? Far-right opposition leaders like Radonsky and others that were elected as members of parliament in this latest election. There's also an important disconnection of the opposition with reality. And I believe that it's important to talk about that because, that's something that has been there always, but I believe that disconnection is getting broader with opposition so-called leader Maria Machado talking about trying to make any sort of, social media plots trying to portray that she's about to ask President Maduro and the Venezuelan government is about to collapse. Keep lying to her followers mostly, and broaden that disconnection between reality and what they are trying to promote. And also, it's important to highlight the struggle to align the opposition behavior, I'm talking about the far-right opposition behavior, with this also mentioned by Radica, related to the nasty and racist U.S. immigration policy, immigration behavior towards Venezuelan migrants. And that, in my opinion, has brought a lot of disconnection between far-right opposition and its own followers. So that's basically the context of the international context and the reality of the opposition before the elections. And the results, as I will show you, and as Radica already said, is very solid, a very solid victory of Chavismo with 23 out of 24 governorships and 82% of the parliament. So that's something that is it's a very solid Chavista victory. The electoral abstention meet is something that also was mentioned by Radica, but it's important to highlight that it was nothing in comparison. The turnout for the 2005 parliamentary election and the 2020 parliamentary elections was smaller, shorter than the one in this election. So this argument, promoted by the opposition about like a big winning of the abstention is something that is very, debatable. The criticism on CNN behavior. We in Orinoco Tribune have, and we have raised it several times already, some criticism about the National Electoral Council behavior, especially since the presidential elections last year. And I would talk about that a little bit at the end of my words. And I believe that it's important to highlight. We have received some criticism or comments from followers on social media, especially about how it's possible that, for example, the governor of Guyana, the recently elected governor of Guyana, Esequiba, got 96% of the votes, for example. And some people don't believe, when they see election figures with those percentages so high, they don't believe in that. So there's this people questioning the numbers, and I just want to say that this election in Guyana, Esequibo, is very unusual. It's the first time we do this because of a referendum that we had in December 2023. And of course the voting base, the voting record for that state is pretty short, and it's mostly consists of people supporting of Chavismo. So for that reason, you might have that number that it might sound unusual, but it's pretty easy to explain statistically talking. As the result of the percentages of the elections in this last election a few months ago. I believe that it's important to say that the elections happen under sanctions. The elections were held under the threat of terrorist plots. The elections were held including far-right oppositions, as Radica and I just said, and there was no a state of siege or emergency decree uh, um, in force during the elections, as it happened in Ecuador and other countries that the U.S. called democracies. So it's important to highlight that. And again, the turnout was 43.18% with the last bulletin with results from the CNE. The PSUV won 23 out of 24 state governorships, and control right now 256 seats in the parliament, including the 3 indigenous seats that were won by indigenous organizations close to Chavismo. So that's basically, this is the map. Here you can see the map of the 2020 National Assembly with the Chavismo having 256 seats. So right now is the same number, but because of some statistical and population things, the National Assembly seats for this election were 285. So in in absolute terms, Chavismo retained the same number of seats, but opposition have almost 10 more seats than in the previous election, in the previous parliament. So the opposition have 29 positions after these elections, when it has 20 positions in the previous parliament. This is a map of all the Venezuelan states, and before the parliamentary and governor election, and this is a map of the Venezuela with the results. Right now, only Cojedes, I believe, is the only state that has an opposition governor. And it's important to highlight that Apure and Zulia state. Zulia is a very important state that was in hand. Is this one that is in the east, in the west of the country. And it's a very important state with one of the biggest population, very close to Colombia. And the other important victory was in Barinas, which is the home place for Hugo Chavez, and that governorship was also won by Chavismo in this election, along with Nueva Esparta, that people know as Margarita Island, which is this island in the north east part of the country. So that's basically the results of the elections. These are some numbers that I just want to share because I use this table here to.
Yeah, please wrap up soon.
Yes, I want to finish. But I wanted to show you that this chart with the numbers of the vote of Chavismo and the votes of opposition in the recent parliamentary elections. And as you can see here, and Radica also said, between 2020 and 2025, the number of Chavista votes grew significantly, like something million votes, as Radica already said. And instead, the numbers of opposition votes actually decrease in comparison with previous elections for opposition. And the turnout also, as I already said, in 2010, in 2005 or in 2020 was way smaller than in 2025. So that argument that Chavismo was not that the turnout was too high is not a very valid argument. And here you can see also, if you compare with other countries, you can see here that the turnout in U.S. Midterm elections is pretty similar to the Venezuelan one. and that also in the European Union parliamentary elections, the turnout is also very close to 40%. So it's a very regular turnout for this kind of elections. And just to wrap up, I want to say that next, what we believe is important for Venezuela after this election is that Venezuelan government and we as a whole, the Venezuelans that wants to, make stronger the Bolivarian revolution, we need to work in improving the salary issues, inflation issues, and public service issues that we are facing. We are about to hold municipal elections on July 27. We are almost 1 month away from that election, and Chavismo is going certainly to win those elections, especially because of the situation of the opposition that remains, keeps its electoral abstentionist strategy, which doesn't help them in any way. We are going to have a constitutional reform maybe for December of this year or January of this year. And another important thing that I want to mention to close is that we Chavistas need that the National Electoral Council publish the results of the elections, because that, in my opinion, is one of the key elements that allow us as Venezuelans to validate the results. And since the elections, these last presidential elections, we haven't seen, of course, there were arguments and the government explained that there was a humongous, very important hacking attack against the electoral, infrastructure. But after 1 year, we have not seen those results, and those results are important for analysts, for everyone that wants to see. I'm talking about results. I'm not trying to replicate the right-wing argument about seeing the electoral ballots and whatever thing they invent to try to discredit the elections. But the results, the detailed results of the election have not been published since the last presidential election. And in this parliamentary election that just happened, we haven't seen the results yet. And that's something that is worrisome for many of us in the Chavismo side that likes to see, and we're proud of that system that the Electoral Council has in relation to the elections.
To the point.
Yes, I'm ready. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, I thought you were going to make 2 more points, so.
That's it.
Okay, all right. Okay, lovely. Thank you. We are going to go on to our next speaker. Thank you very much for that, Jesus. We have to have a slight change in plans because Professor Marandi has joined us, but he also says that he has to leave earlier than expected. So I'm going to go to Professor Marandi next. Professor Mohammed Marandi, Professor Syed Mohammed Marandi does not need much introduction. Formally speaking, he is Professor of Comparative Literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. But of course, most of us know him as an extremely astute and penetrating commentator on world affairs in general. And in recent years, of course, on the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and of course, in recent weeks, on the United States' unprecedented and potentially very dangerous attack on Iran. So Professor Marandi was also among the election observers. So Professor Marandi, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you very much for inviting me. Indeed, it was an honor and a pleasure being in Venezuela for the elections. It was my 3rd trip to Venezuela, and actually my 4th trip to Venezuela. And one of the things that I found very encouraging, elections aside, was that compared to my previous experiences, the economic situation seems to have improved. And that was something that I felt was true in speaking with different Venezuelans, shop owners, and people who I had the opportunity to speak with. And that is very important because Venezuela, of course, as we know, is facing severe sanctions. And the objective of sanctions is to make life miserable, to bring people to their knees in order that people submit to empire. If the empire was certain about its superiority and certain about its moral legitimacy and certain that people by nature would choose to follow the empire, there would be no need for punitive sanctions targeting women and children and making life miserable for ordinary people. So it is understandable that a segment of society in any country that is sanctioned would find it difficult and would grumble about their situation and would either refrain from voting or vote for a way out. But the reality is that there is no real way out, because our experience has shown that submitting to the empire only makes the situation worse. We saw that in the case of Iran, whenever Iran did an agreement with the United States immediately began to undermine the agreement. It would expect Iran to carry out its side of the bargain, and then it would continue to expand the sanctions regime through other means and in other names. And of course, we see the comparison between Cuba and Syria. Cuba is still sanctioned. It is suffering immensely. Yet the United States considers it a threat to its own existence and the well-being of Americans. Yet Syria, which has been destroyed by a coalition of pro-Western countries, including regional countries like Turkey, Qatar, among others, now that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are in charge, the United States and the Europeans have decided to remove many of the sanctions. So apparently, Syria under ISIS and Al-Qaeda is not a threat to American and European stability and security, but Cuba is. So that is, I think, a good example of why we should never trust the Americans, never trust the empire, and we have to forge our own way forward. One other point that I would like to mention is that based on our experience in the last few weeks, in particular, since the Israeli regime war against the Iranian people, which was waged with the support of the West, with the support of Europe and the United States, and with the support of Western-dominated international bodies, it has become clear that electronic goods that are controlled by the West are a threat to ordinary people and to independent governments. And I think this is something that the audience should think about. They should move away from all electronic goods, and this is not just cell phones. And they should move away from all apps as much as possible that are linked to Western companies. And those companies include Japanese and South Korean companies, because they are all bound to the American empire. They are bound to the American camp. The United States and the Israeli regime used apps in Iran, such as apps controlled by Meta, among other things, to trace individuals, to trace families, to strike buildings, to gather intelligence and information. So I think it is very important for everyone to find apps, cell phones, and all electronic goods that are not produced by the West or controlled by Western companies or governments that are affiliated to the West. This is something very important. And I think all activists in particular should be the first to be concerned about this, and communities at large should be thinking about this. Because in future, if the United States targets a country, it is clear what they will be using in order to undermine individuals, communities, and countries in particular. So this is one of the lessons learned over the past couple of weeks. Another lesson, although I would add, is that the United States is not as powerful as it claims. We saw that despite the blitzkrieg attack on Iran and the illegal war against Iran, which again was supported by the West, and despite the initial slaughter of women and children and individuals who were in their homes, that the Israeli regime, with all the support from the West, ultimately begged for a ceasefire. So that is encouraging for our friends across the global South, and I think in Venezuela in particular. But finally, Venezuela. I think it is clear that anyone who has visited Venezuela would see why the United States would like to undermine this country. It is a country rich in resources, and it is a country that is not only rich in oil, but it is rich in every way imaginable. Minerals, but also agriculture has huge potential in that country. And we've seen, thankfully, over recent years, excellent moves to make the country more self-sufficient. And I think it is the obligation of people across the global South and Latin America in particular to try to purchase goods from Venezuela to help strengthen the economy rather than purchasing goods from entities that are loyal to empire. But what I saw in the election was a reasonable turnout. And as the previous speaker pointed out, the turnout across the world, and especially in North America and Europe, has decreased over the years. So if one was to complain about the turnout in Venezuela, they would have to first and foremost complain about midterm elections in general in the United States and, of course, the European Union elections. I'm not saying that Venezuela has a perfect government. No government on this planet is perfect, but Venezuela has independence. And decisions made in Caracas are the decisions that are the most important decisions for the people of Venezuela. Unlike many countries in Latin America, and especially in my part of the world, where the real decisions are made in Washington, and even European decisions nowadays are being made increasingly openly made in Washington. I think it is of great significance that in Venezuela we do see decisions being made in Caracas. And I think that is one reason that despite the difficulties and the suffering that the United States has imposed upon the people of Venezuela, that we do see a significant and reasonable turnout, a process that was completely peaceful from what I saw. Wherever I went, everything was peaceful. Wherever they took us, everything was orderly. And there was no violence. And the process, as far as I could see, was open and I think fair. It's fair to say that it was completely legitimate. But at the end, I want to go back to the point that I made earlier, and that is that there is no such thing as Western democracy. Western democracy, as one of your speakers earlier said, is a system where the empire constantly undermines other countries and destroys them one after another, whether it's Libya or Yemen or Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or Lebanon or Palestine or elsewhere. These Western countries are effectively rogue regimes. And the populations in the West, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, are completely propagandized. It doesn't matter if it's so-called the liberal CNN or the conservative Fox News. When the United States wants to go into conflict, all of this media, whether it's Breitbart or the New York Times, they all fall in line and demonize. And that shows that there's no democracy of information. And if there is no democracy of information, there is no democracy at all. So the West is definitely it is not a model that we should follow. And it is a model that we should steer clear of. And therefore, it is our responsibility to support the people of Venezuela and the government in Venezuela, because it has preserved its territorial integrity and its independence, despite the fact that the rogue Western regimes have constantly been trying to undermine it. I felt that within Venezuela, discussion was open, like in Tehran, like in Iran, contrary to the myths that are promoted by Western media. In Iran, people have their say. If you go into a taxi, if you go on a bus, if you're on campus, if you're in class, if you're in the metro, or if you're in a government office, people have their say and they criticize and attack from top to bottom whenever they wish. In Venezuela, I felt that people were at ease. Those who were critical were openly critical. Those who disliked the government openly showed their dislike. But on the whole, what I saw was a people who felt that their pain and suffering had a lot more to do with the United States and the empire than anything else. And the fact that the elections were held peacefully and that the turnout was reasonable is more than enough to convince any sane person in the West that sanctions must be removed. But of course, we have no expectations because the United States is not led by normal, humane people. However, finally, I'd like to point out that the empire is on the decline, and we should be optimistic about the future, and that there is light at the end of the tunnel. The weaker the US empire and the Western empire becomes, the more closer we are towards, or the closer we are towards freedom from empire. And that should give us optimism. When I went to Cuba last, well, I only went once, but when I went to Cuba briefly, I saw immense suffering there. And it just showed to me how irrational and hateful the regime in Washington is. But hopefully in the coming years and in the next 2 or 3 years, with the changes that are taking place in the global economy, the hold of the United States over the global economy and financial institutions will become less relevant, and the people of Venezuela, Cuba, and people across the global South will be able to breathe more easily. Thank you very much for inviting me. And again, my congratulations to the people of Venezuela. Our solidarity is always with the people of the global South, and I hope all of you work hard to expose the aggressive nature of the regime in Washington towards the Iranian people as well. But most importantly, exposing the Holocaust in Gaza is a responsibility for all of us to carry out every day from morning to night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for those very important words. Of course, coming from Iran, we know that Professor Marandi is a member of another society which is suffering under extremely cruel US sanctions. Thank you again, and we hope very much that you can stay to the question and answers. But if you can't, we of course entirely understand. We particularly appreciate that you always take time out of your very busy, stressful, not to say dangerous schedule. So thank you very much. Okay, we should go on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is, sorry, just one second. Yes, our next speaker is Sonia Surabhi Gupta. Sonia Gupta is a professor of Latin American Studies at Jamia Millia Islamia Central University in New Delhi. So, Sonia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm also grateful, of course, for the opportunity which was given to us to witness the recent parliamentary and regional elections in May this year. It was like witnessing history as it is being made, and to participate, even if it was just as an observer, in the process of the creation of a new model of democracy, which Sira was talking about, was indeed an inspiring and a learning experience. So one salutes actually the brave people of Venezuela who for years and years have been living under sanctions and being demonized by powerful lobbies in the world, and must be really difficult. In fact, there's so much calumny and so much hateful false propaganda that is churned out against countries that refuse to surrender to the diktats of the empire, that it's always important for people who stand in solidarity, for example, in this case with Venezuela, to keep abreast of developments and renew our perspective and keep learning. I teach Latin American history and culture in Jamia, a public university here in New Delhi. And one of the topics that we deal with in the class is the conquest of America, which we read as the beginning of colonialism and racial capitalism. And we talk about this fierce debate which took place in Valladolid in 1550, in the heart of the empire, the Spanish Empire, between the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas and the humanist scholar Juan Gines de Sepúlveda. Las Casas had returned from nearly 50 years of in the Americas. He had been the Bishop of Chiapas, and he had witnessed the appalling cruelties of the colonizers on the native people, on the indigenous people. The central question which was being raised in this Valladolid debate was whether or not the indigenous peoples of the Americas were fully human, and as humans entitled to rights and protection like the European colonizers. As I teach this cultural history course, students are often surprised that the terms of that debate are quite the same as we hear today when the empire intervenes in sovereign nations, arrogating itself this moral force. The colonial rhetoric really hasn't changed much. So coming back to the Valladolid debate, Gines de Sepúlveda, drawing on Aristotle, was arguing that the indigenous people of America were natural slaves. They were incapable of self-government, and it was Spain's moral duty to wage war on them. So Sepúlveda used this concept of just war to justify Spanish conquest, arguing that given their practices of cannibalism, human sacrifice, these barbarians needed to be subjugated and civilized. Las Casas, of course, challenged this interpretation, arguing that the Spanish were not engaged in a just war, but what they were carrying out was, in fact, a campaign of aggression and exploitation. And in fact, Las Casas went so far as to defend even human sacrifice, because he said that the greatest and the most valuable good, which is human life, that is what they are offering with, and it was a mark of religious feeling and not barbarism or irrationality. About 500 odd years later, we hear a similar rhetoric from imperial quarters. For example, in the 2003 Iraq War, the Bush administration was arguing vigorously that it was a just war based on the prevention of the grave threat that the WMDs posed. So the so-called civilized world, the civilized world, free world, we have heard Bibi Netanyahu use these terms in the very recent speeches during the Zionist aggression against Iran. And they have kind of become euphemisms for the empire. So what it does in the name of civilization, first and foremost, like earlier times, the empire vilifies, demonizes, and bestializes anyone who stands for an alternative worldview. What the Bolivarian process represents is certainly a civilizational alternative, and therefore it becomes a threat, and its othering becomes imperative. So the war against Venezuela, which is being fought, as we all know, is not just through sanctions and coercive economic measures, but it's in the realm of culture. It's in the realm of images to justify this range of actions, which the final, I think, ultimate aim being a regime change and fostering democracy. In India, the information and the images that reach us through mainstream media are predominantly a redeployment of the same narrative as big news agencies hand over to our media houses. So one is grateful to alternative media sources, including those represented here, for helping us understand what is happening in Venezuela. And therefore, being a witness to the election process on May 25 was a very important opportunity for us. So I speak not as a neutral observer or an expert, but as someone profoundly partisan to the process, someone who is interested in it and looks at it with a lot of hope. We were actually three of us from India. And while we are aware that any serious estimation of the Bolivarian process as it stands today cannot be a black and white picture, we found ourselves in the midst of a reality that that clearly belied the image the mainstream media presents on the ongoing Bolivarian process and its leaders, which is usually a caricature. So Nicolas Maduro as dictator, hated by the people, and the people of Venezuela kind of with no freedom to express any contrarian views, elections being won by fraud, and so on and so forth. So we had the opportunity to witness the PSUV's last election rally in Petare, in this neighborhood, and it was a unique opportunity. Of course, Petare is this huge neighborhood. It's in the province of Miranda, and in the eastern hills of Caracas. And Elio Serrano, who was the incumbent PSUV governor, he was seeking re-election. Contrary to the image of the people, kind of living in oppressive dictatorial regime who can't open their mouth, etc., what we saw was a vibrant people and popular enthusiasm in the election rally. It reminded us of our own rallies, songs, music, of course, but the vibrancy was even more. So, slogans and placards. The rally was also a demonstration, I think, of the organizational strength of the PSUV. It has been mentioned by one of the speakers how the Chavistas actually went mobilizing people door to door this time. And the campaign actually, one could see in this rally, that was the last rally, and one could see that this campaign for strengthening the participatory democratic process through elections finds quite a lot of popular support, which in what we know is a highly polarized society otherwise. In fact, we asked one of the Chavista organizers that they must have put in a lot of hard work to mobilize so many people for such a huge rally. And she smiled and she said, no, it comes naturally to us. In other words, what we were seeing is mobilized Chavismo. So this mobilized Chavismo is, of course, a result of the actual vibrancy and the political zeal of the Bolivarian process. Because it's very clear that for more than 2 decades, Washington has been intervening in the Venezuelan society to kind of sap the support for the revolution, like it has been doing in Cuba, kind of guillotine the revolution, people will get fed up. But the Bolivarian revolution, amidst all the difficulties and the roadblocks, including some of their own making, has certainly been able to continue to maintain its popular base, was the impression we got. The 42.66 turnout, which was announced, which of course now has been updated to 43.18, may seem a tad low for us in India, but in the context of the call for boycott, of predictions by the opposition that barely a 15% were going to vote, it certainly represents a great victory for the democratic process itself. But why the boycott? Of course, we know the reasons, but we asked the Chavistas and, the people who were helping us out. And a young Chavista just quipped and said, it's profitable to be in opposition. Indeed, the figures, if you see of Venezuelan far right who go to the US and, they get this royal treatment. And
One minute, Sonia.
Yeah, I'm finishing. As an Indian who may be very critical of our own democracy, it is incomprehensible how public figures, from the Venezuelan political space can ask for expansion of sanctions against their own, So this mobilized Chavismo that we noticed, which Sira was referring to, especially since 2023, the kind of democracy which with the kind of Venezuelan society which the constitution describes as democratic, participatory, and protagonistic. So this concept of protagonistic democracy, which is an aspiration to strengthen the role of the citizens in the direction of the state, as opposed to the leading role of typically played by elected representatives, as we see in our own democracy in India. This clearly has forged a new kind of citizen, and it is an alternative form of democracy, a new way of life, where democracy itself becomes a site of revolution. And for those of us who are interested in radicalizing democracies, I think the election of May 25 was indeed an eye-opener. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was such a fresh perspective, particularly coming from India, where the comparisons are quite telling in some ways. Although, of course, Indian democracy is in great danger today, partly precisely due to the imperialist forces that Venezuela is up against. Okay, we have two more speakers. Our next speaker is Diego Siqueira. Diego Siqueira is with Mission Verdad, another one of those alternative media organizations on which, of course, as Sonia said, we rely so much. So please go ahead, Diego. And yeah, please unmute yourself. I'm just saying, okay, it should work. Yes.
Yes. Well, the best part of being on the last end of these webinars is that all the previous speakers have done the works. They have taken care of all the analytics, and they just take off a lot of burden from one. So I'm going to go even more personal on some aspects, and I'm going to jump back and forth with some elements because otherwise every other base has been already covered, I believe. Also, wonderful takes. Beautiful take by Sonia, by the way. Fun fact, I know I'm maybe losing time with this, but de las Casas, Ley de las Casas, I read somewhere, had also a project of a commune in Cariaco, in eastern Venezuela. Something that didn't happen anyway, but it was one of them in his writing, some project he aspired to engage in, but it never happened, of course. But almost all being said, I mean, this was another example of another election under duress. Personally, I would have liked even a more split map. I know it sounds contradictory, perhaps, but I would have liked to see even more presence of the legal, coherent opposition that also exists in Venezuela, because this, yes, of course, it means a lot internally, and it also adds up a lot to the moment, the Numantin moment that we have to deal with in Venezuela. Just like Cuba, we're being surrounded and not by water. So in that sense, it creates an interesting and uncomfortable divide. For once, yes, of course, inside the country, it is significant how many things are re-strengthened, and but on the outside, it's going to be weaponized some way or another, regardless of what we have not seen yet coming from the usual suspects or from the usual places. And but also have different explanations to this, and I'm still thinking about the opposition in this case. For example, I know for a fact, and many of us know, that many of these leaders, locally or nationally or internationally, have been under a lot of pressure and threats from the more radicalized extremist factions of the opposition. There's a silent ongoing war in that front that we need to really take into account. It's not that easy either to detect, but it is there. So it makes even more commendable what people like who have been considering him an idiot for the last 15 years, people like Enrique Capriles, are actually having the political decency to know how much, not only because they lose a lot of political capital themselves, they already did, they also have suffered from the consequences of the hybrid warfare in general, but also because it takes, at least it's another step in engage in actual, very needed politics in Venezuela. The other aspect that I think it also adds up to this and also makes even more crazy the other factions, it's precisely the backlash on a very grassroots level that the deportations and the whole Palestinization of Venezuela and the penitentiary colonial system that's been built in Central America regarding deportations, not only, of course, of Venezuela, but we have seen how the viciousness it has been exerted against the Venezuelans. Many of these were actually opposition, passive or active, to the government, and now they find in a place that they're being actually rescued in many cases by the government, which I think it brings a lot of cognitive dissonance. Also, in this sense, yes, a very quiet day. I vote on actually more of an opposition stronghold. I amuse myself calling it a frontline commune, because it's also organized as a commune. It also participates with very important rates on the consultations, the frequent consultations regarding local projects that are going to benefit the whole commune. And for the people, this is a full disclosure moment, I guess. For the people that know Caracas, it's pretty funny to hear about La Comuna de las Mercedes, Santa Fe, Prados del Este. I mean, it's pretty funny of the kind of moment we're actually living right now. And also it talks about the demographic change that have been ensued in time for many reasons. Saying this, and one more thing about this, it's taking into account what, for example, Sira said about the commune, I will add something else which makes it even more worthy to take into consideration, because she was, well, she said it like as it is, but it's also a tough, not sexy, not spectacular process. This is a daily thing that deals with a huge, insane amount of frustrations, contradictions, economic distortions, classic stupidity, political folklore, and so on. So it's even harder. It's a very, very hard moment. Now I can also quote slightly Professor Marandi, who talked about, for example, how on an interview he gave to Misión Verdade, how his friends from Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance during the first stage of their liberation, before they actually kicked out the Israelis from southern Lebanon, they weren't that loved. Actually, they were thrown, stones were thrown at them. They meant trouble when they appeared because of what the enemy would do, reacting to this presence and so forth. And when the triumph came, they all were supportive of this. So of course it's not a similar situation, but it also describes, in a very less violent and intense environment, what kind of challenges they have. Also, it's very uneven how it happened inside the country, locally speaking. I'm very sensitive to this matter, and I worked for a long time in one of these states that actually was recovered politically. So it's not the same. It wasn't the same regarding Zulia or Barinas or Nueva Esparta, especially because this is local politics, and that has a lot to do. And these were spaces that the party operated as an opposition, but at the same time, depending on the context, as actually representatives of the state, not necessarily the government, but many institutions were actually still under Chavista ministries, et cetera, et cetera. So they played a very different role, and in some cases very challenging, very sharp, and in others pretty frustrating as well. In the case of Barinas, I know, for example, that one of the explanations of the victory was the low turnout of the opposition, and also they were very split. There were like 4 candidates, but in the case of in the case of Nueva Esparta, it was the difference. It was a very intense, strong struggle, and they actually, a very different dynamic. Saying all that, you have to also keep in mind that this is happening elections in a moment that basically, if you see what, especially in the Western Venezuela, it's still a Western country, the GMO politics war and the clash of engineering, the significance of elections having, which also makes them quite hard to relate to or to deposit all your trust in them. But at the same time, it strengthens it also has to take into account how this is part of Venezuelan law and the ways it has been engaged, and how next calculations, regardless of what I said, a less enthusiastic approach to this, our president have, which is always 3 steps ahead of chaos, just like El Comandante taught us. Thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you, Diego, so much that you kept perfectly in time. And thank you for those very important and interesting remarks. I'm going to not comment on them, but just go on to our last speaker, and that's Alison Bodine. Alison is a founding member of the Venezuela Solidarity Network and coordinator of the Fire This Time movement for social justice. That is to say, the Venezuela Solidarity campaign of the Fire This Time movement for social justice. And Alison is also the author of an important book about Venezuela. So Alison, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you to all the previous speakers. As Diego said, it's definitely more easy to be here at the end, and hopefully I'd like to provide some perspective, some international perspective as to the significance of this victory, of the May 25th elections in Venezuela, and also an appeal to everyone here to get involved in taking action in defense of Venezuela. Attending the webinar and the work of the International Manifesto group is part of that, but hopefully also getting involved in other work to take solidarity with the fighting people of Venezuela. As Radhika said, I am here representing the Venezuela Solidarity Network, which is a network of groups mostly in Canada and the United States, what I'll refer to as North America, but I'm also open to others to join, and I'll put links in the chat for how you can get involved with that. And also as the coordinator of Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice Venezuela Solidarity Campaign here in Vancouver, Canada, on the Unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. I'll start my presentation today with a quote. It says, following Venezuela's sham elections, May 25th, which were boycotted by the main opposition coalition and marked by an embarrassing low voter turnout, dictator Nicolas Maduro is likely done pretending to hold free elections. The vote was such a fiasco for the regime's hopes of recovering international recognition that Maduro now says he plans to change the constitution and hold future elections under a, quote, communal electoral system. Needless to say, this would secure for him, much like in Cuba, guaranteed victories. That is a quote from Andres Oppenheimer in an opinion piece he wrote in the Miami Herald, which shouldn't surprise anyone here, following the elections, which we've just spent the last hour and 20 minutes discussing. All of us observed, whether within Venezuela as Venezuelans or as international observers, really the exact opposite of what he said. And I wanted to start with this quote so that we better understand what we are up against when we leave this room or this space of the webinar or the progressive movements in which we work. Because this quote almost word for word embodies the opposite of what we've discussed today and what we observed in Venezuela, while managing to encapsulate really the fundamental error that I think mouthpieces for imperialism make when they discuss Venezuela, which is that they dismiss people in the neighborhoods, in the streets, within community projects and communes. They dismiss the protagonists of the Bolivarian revolutionary process, the everyday Venezuelan people. No, not everyone in Venezuela supports President Maduro, the PSUV, or the Bolivarian Revolution, or any parties in the Grand Patriotic Poll, which is the electoral bloc of the Bolivarian Revolution. But while the Venezuelan opposition is sulking about their former glory or begging the United States to invade Venezuela, the people and organizations of the Bolivarian revolutionary process are in a constant state of mobilization. And this is not only true during an election campaign, but every day in Venezuela when people defend their sovereignty, their self-determination in the face of criminal US sanctions and what some people refer to as a hybrid war of covert and overt imperialist intervention in Venezuela. As an international elections observer, during this recent regional and parliamentary election, we all observed just one aspect of this struggle, or some of us, were able to take the time of being in Venezuela to visit a commune or visit a neighborhood alongside the election. And people have spoken today about the same things that I also observed. When we visited voting centers, we spoke with voters about their impression of the voting process itself. People expressed confidence in the voting process. They were excited, and they were committed to exercise their right to vote. This included both pro-revolution and opposition voters who came out despite the call for a boycott, which had some impact and some effect on certain people. The opposition voters did see the electoral process as a way to bring a counter-revolutionary change to Venezuela. There are still those that believe that. And this is in contrast to the US-backed right-wing opposition that resorts to violence, sabotage, attempted coup, which were happening in real time just days leading up to the election. and this is the faction that boycotted the May 25th election. As others have said, this election took place under continued sanctions and attacks from US imperialism. The Trump administration still continues to enact a maximum pressure campaign of attacks on the people of Venezuela, and especially Venezuelan migrants in the United States, who are, of course, there because of the hybrid war itself, despite, as what others have said, a change in rhetoric coming from the Trump administration as of late towards Venezuela. The PSUV campaign slogan for this election was Gente que resuelve. I don't know if people can see. These are our tags of international observers. And that means people that resolve. That's one way to translate it. And how I understood this is with this election, they've dealt another blow to the continuing attempts by the United States to overthrow President Nicolas Maduro and the Bolivarian revolutionary process, to overthrow the gains made by poor, working, and oppressed people in Venezuela over the last 26 years. That is the sense that with this great victory for the Bolivarian revolutionary process, Venezuelans have indeed resolved, as the slogan says, to defend their sovereignty and self-determination foremost. As President Maduro said during a rally I attended where the election's results were announced, where I went at about 12:30 at night to downtown central Caracas, Venezuela, just to say as an aside, very safe, very, peaceful, energetic. President Maduro said, "This victory belongs to the noble people of Venezuela, to you, ordinary men and women. I congratulate you all for your tremendous effort. After blockades, criminal sanctions, fascism, and violence, the Bolivarian Revolution has proven itself stronger and more relevant than ever. Yes, indeed, the United States did not want to see yet another free and fair election in Venezuela, but the people of Venezuela won again." Now, of course, the words of President Maduro were not meant to just stay within the election and within that night. It was a clear call to continue what Venezuela has already been in the process of for 26 years. The elections in Venezuela were about 1 month ago today, but the dynamism that I'd like to convey means that the mobilization and even the exercise of democracy itself didn't stop in that moment or with that night. Not only, of course, has the National Assembly begun to meet and discuss and debate, but Venezuelans continued rallying in the streets. Most recently, for example, in rallies that took place over a number of days for Iran and Palestine against imperialist intervention. Or Venezuela has now launched a national youth consultation process because they're leading up to the next phase of communal elections, which are grassroots elections where people vote on local projects. And this one is focused on the demands and requests and organizing of young people in Venezuela. Now I come to an important question, which I think we have the responsibility to ask ourselves, to be able to really explain why we are in this fight in defense of Venezuela, and how can we convince others to join us. Venezuela is in the crosshairs of the US government's bipartisan war machine because the Bolivarian revolutionary process is a project in defense of independence and sovereignty. Throughout the past 34 elections in the last 26 or 27 years, every time that Venezuelans recommit themselves to the Bolivarian Revolution, they commit themselves to a project that has made independence from US dictates central to its program. And as evidence of that, I think all of the speakers today have mentioned some aspect of that independence. At the same time, with great credit to the fighting and mobilized people of Venezuela, every time that the US government escalates their attacks or tightens deadly and criminal sanctions against Venezuela, this resolve for independence and sovereignty deepens in the revolutionary Venezuelan people. And this can be seen and felt on the streets of Venezuela. It's also important, I think, to understand how this resolve resonates through Venezuela's relationships with other countries. And in fact, how this resolve resonates through all countries that the US government targets. Under US attack, thank you, countries like Venezuela, Iran, and all anti-imperialist, anti-colonial countries, in fact, become closer, it becomes stronger against imperialism and colonialism. As I've said, the victory for the PSUV in the regional and legislative elections in Venezuela in May was a great victory for poor, working, and oppressed people around the world. The victory for the PSUV in the Venezuelan election, I also want to say, is a victory for Iran, a victory for Palestine, a victory for Hezbollah in Lebanon, a victory for Yemen. We must understand the dynamism and motion around us today. The dynamism of class struggle is unfolding. We see that Venezuela and Cuba are really the center of political gravity for Latin America, and that is the same dynamism of class struggle that is unfolding in West Asia and North Africa. And the center of political gravity for this developing momentum is no country but Iran. And second to Iran, once again, Iran. In the last 46 years, since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Iran has never been so critical in the liberation of West Asia and North Africa, so central to resisting Zionism, colonialism, and imperialism. There's a developing anti-imperialist and anti-colonial dynamism that we observe in Venezuela that continued with the election of President Maduro and this recent election on May 25th. And I'm hoping that Russia and China will properly and enthusiastically recognize this importance. The victory of PSUV and President Maduro in the last elections in Venezuela has connected a thread that we can see in the coming few years will continue to connect countries like Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Yemen, and other countries in this new energy and class struggle. The recent US-Israeli attack on Iran is nothing but an attempt to close off this development and reverse the gains of the Iranian Revolution and reverse the impact of Iran's self-determination and Iran's independence that has become an inspiration for oppressed nations in West Africa, the same way they are attacking Venezuela's independence and self-determination. I will say that Venezuela and defending Venezuela must be a central task for anti-imperialists and anyone who believes that a better and just world is not only necessary but possible. We must see this with clarity, and we must join together and unite. So I just call on people to redouble our efforts and raise our voices for hands off Venezuela with more determination and more unity before. I'll put links in the chat about joining together in the Venezuela Solidarity Network, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. What a fantastic close to this very important webinar. I'm so glad that you reiterated, well, not only, of course, the deep connection of what's happening in Venezuela with that in Iran, but also insisted that the kind of pressure that the United States is putting on these countries simply further deepens the determination of countries to resist. And I think sometimes even if it is lost for some years or a decade or two, as in Nicaragua, it often returns because capitalism is simply not the solution. Okay, folks, we are ready for questions and answers. All our speakers are here. I underline all because I believe Professor Marandi is back. I guess he had to leave for a brief time, but so he is also around. So, please feel free to raise your hand and put questions. And I also invite the speakers themselves if they wish to address any questions to one another. Carlos, I have you, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Radhika, and thank you to all the speakers for really interesting, really illuminating talks. I was just before this meeting started, had been reading President Maduro's call for a global peace summit to establish what he called a lasting peace in West Asia, with the focus specifically on dismantling Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal and program, which is not something that a lot of people are talking about, even in spite of the fact that it's a very obvious thing to talk about, you might think. And you just contrast that with how the US and its allies, Britain, France, Germany, have responded to and engaged with this criminal war in Iran and the genocide in Gaza. And to me, I think it's just, and this chimes with what Alison was just saying, but it's really a reminder of the revolutionary internationalism that's part and parcel of the Venezuelan project of Chavismo. This is really why Venezuela is demonized to such an extent. Not only does it assert its own sovereignty, but it stands in solidarity with people around the world against imperialism and it's a key part of the multipolar project. You know, it stands with Palestine, it stands with Cuba, with Nicaragua, very close relations with China, Russia, Iran. It's China's #1 trading partner in Latin America. Hugo Chavez visited China 6 or 7 times during his presidency. He called for China and Latin America to construct a great wall against hegemonism. And you know, that kind of puts it in a very similar category to Iran, as Alison said. Again, you know, Iran being another country that protects its own sovereignty, but which is also the #1 provider of material support to the Palestinian resistance and is very much integrated with the whole multipolar project. So Venezuela is really on the front line in the #1 political process of the current era, i.e. the construction of a multipolar world and the dismantling of the US-led imperialist system. So my question for the panelists is, to what extent is this revolutionary internationalism kind of embedded into everyday politics in Venezuela? You know, when people vote for Chavismo, as they do again and again for the PSUV, are they voting for a project that's not only about their own country, but about the future of the world? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I have Kimeng, and then I would also like to ask a question. So Kimeng, please go ahead. Hang on, let me see. Okay, yeah, you are unmuted now.
My question is, does anyone know whether Venezuela is going to try to apply for BRICS membership?
Okay, thank you very much for that. And my own question connects up, I think, with what Carlos was talking about, and that is, I mean, he asked a question about, well, related to Carlos's question. What I wanted to ask goes back to Sira's presentation and, the more general things that she pointed out, about the substantial democracy in Venezuela, etc. And then also Carlos mentioned the internationalism of the Venezuelan people, etc. I mean, how exactly did you see these things, the substantial democracy, the internationalism expressed by the Maduro government, and, of course, the determination to resist sanctions, as opposed to, people saying, which sometimes it is perfectly understandable if they say so, that, look, we're tired of these sanctions, anything to make them stop, even if it means giving up our independence. So to what extent did you see these elements at work when you were doing your election monitoring, etc. So having said that, these are 3 questions to you all. We can go in the same order as the speakers. So we can begin with Arnold. Arnold, did you want to respond to any of these questions?
That was a great, very good discussion by the panelists and all these questions. I'd just like to respond to what Carlos raised, a very important point regarding the internationalist nature of the Bolivarian Revolution. How do we see it on the ground? Well, if anyone has a chance to visit Caracas, I would suggest they go to the 23 de enero, or the January 23rd neighborhood. There you'll get a great feeling how the internationalist nature of the Bolivarian Revolution is deeply embedded in the consciousness of the people. First thing you see in 23 de enero is what? Supporting Palestine, Palestinian flags, Bobby Sands, you name it. Any, Che Guevara, any important issue on the international scale, it's part of the fabric of the Bolivarian Revolution. With regards to Palestine, under Chavez, he actually made support for Palestine not just a foreign policy tactic. It was made it into the actual national position, national state interests to support the Palestinian people. And we see this today. And there are many other examples in other neighborhoods as well.
Thank you, Carlos. Sira, would you like to respond in any way? Okay. Sorry. There.
Now, okay. So I was actually going to begin with the same thing that Arnold was saying. When you go to 23, you will 23 de Enero, this working class barrio neighborhood, you will see the walls of the streets flooded with murals of different Palestinian leaders, many of whom are still fighting and others have fallen, are martyrs. But I actually think that it's the question was a question that is very important. Of course, this is the Bolivarian process, and everybody knows that Bolivar was actually calling for the integration of Latin America. No, not a separated Latin America, but an integrated Latin America. And this is core to the Bolivarian process. And I think this is something that's very felt and profoundly understood by Venezuelans. Of course, it is true that the last 10 years, since the beginning of the unilateral coercive measures, have been very, very complex, very difficult, that sometimes in the face of the difficulties, people focus on solving their own problems. But still so, I mean, I'm not very aware of any other countries where there were large marches in support of Iran in recent times. And of course, there have been large marches in support of Palestine. Actually, in my commune, in 23 de Enero, in El Panal commune, we had a very, very large grassroots march in support of Palestine. But I wanted to say that it is true, we should recognize that the blockade has sometimes an impact in people's capacity to mobilize in terms of their international solidarity. But whoever is a Chavista identifies also as a Bolivarian, and as such, as an anti-imperialist and as an internationalist. In terms of the question about Venezuela applying for BRICS, yes, it already applied, and thanks to Brazil, it didn't make it. Really amazing, very sad. And there's an upcoming summit, and Venezuela is still hoping to get in, and we very much hope that Venezuela will make it in. And maybe I shouldn't talk longer because there will be other folks who will want to say something. But I wanted to say that I am going to put in the chat some text about communes, both in Spanish and in English, because I can see that a couple of people have requested that. So stay tuned. In the next couple of minutes, I will be sending some links because I have been working with Chris Gilbert on a work that actually documents communal construction in the context of the US blockade. I think that those books in Spanish, but they appear also in English in Venezuela Analysis, maybe of use, and also a book by Chris Gilbert published by Monthly Review, which is called Commune or Nothing. I will put all that in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Sira. Jesus. You should be able to unmute yourself. Let me see. There. You should, yeah.
Yes. I believe that everything has been said, but I just wanted to add that in terms of the internationalism of Bolivarian Revolution, I, as all previous speakers said, I believe that there has been it's a fact that we have grown this internationalist perspective after the arrival of the Bolivarian Revolution. We didn't have that before, and I believe that that's very important to say it. I mean, most Venezuelans didn't pay too much attention before Chavismo to what happened abroad. And right now, you notice the difference between what we had before and what we have now, and that's extremely important. And I believe that is an internationalism that is not fake. It's very within the nature of Venezuelans. I don't know how to explain it, but I believe that the Bolivarian Revolution has been imprinting that internationalism, but somehow the nature of the Venezuelan people have assimilated very deep And that relates to the Radhika question about the sanctions and the voting and the elections. And I believe that as many people might think that sanctions has somehow create some sort of cohesion among Chavista forces and strengthen Chavismo, despite what some people in the global north believe happens when they sanction us. Those sanctions most of the time has increased our strength in supporting Chavismo and the Bolivarian Revolution, and I believe that is very similar to what happened in other, anti-imperialist countries like Iran, for example. And yes, the BRIC membership is a big shame that Brazil stopped us from joining it. So that's what I wanted to say.
Well, perhaps the very same anti-imperialist forces will finally work on Brazil as well. But meanwhile, Professor Marandi, please go ahead if you would like to respond to the three questions.
I just wanted to say that internationalism is necessary for Venezuela and for all of us in the global south and our friends and allies in the global north. The empire is global, and resistance has to be global as well. And while our Venezuelan sisters and brothers and comrades have supported movements across the global south, the same is true in Iran, and the same is true, I'm sure, among our friends across the global south. Of course, it's clear that for many people, the priority is their own situation, and that's understandable. So we have to, at the same time, as people who support this global movement of resistance, we have to do our part to ease the difficulties and suffering. We can boycott Western corporations, especially American corporations and companies, wherever possible. Their goods, wherever possible, especially, as I said, their electronic goods, which are a threat to the safety and security of all of us. And we can, if we have the means, instead of traveling to other places, to travel to countries that are sanctioned, that to purchase goods from countries that are sanctioned, and of course, online and offline, do everything we can to support the resistance that exists now across the global south. The narrative that the North has been using for decades is falling apart, and we're seeing that even in the West, and even in the United Kingdom. Yesterday, we saw strong opposition to the regime in Tel Aviv and support for the Palestinian people among hundreds, maybe 100 to 200,000 young people at a festival. So we should be optimistic about the future, but at the same time, under no circumstances should we relent. And hopefully, next time we all gather together, there'll be much better news for all of us to report and more optimism for those who stand up against the empire and for the global resistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi. Sonia, did you want to?
I just wanted to say that the kind of optimism there is about BRICS, I think is a little misplaced. We have seen that the governments of the present, I mean, my own government, for example, I mean, India, I don't know whether they're really going to be able to play their role in making a multipolar world. So I think if Venezuela is not there at the moment in BRICS, it isn't losing much. But one thing is sure that it is with the Bolivarian Revolution that CELAC, ALBA, TCP, and UNASUR, all these regional integration bodies had come up, and perhaps there has been a certain weakening of the Latin American regional integration program.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important point you make, especially given that there are just so many governments within the BRICS, or at least some governments in the BRICS, I should say, who are still unable to understand and realize what time it is in history and where they should be turning away from the United States and I think towards the global South. But you are quite right. We are definitely have such governments. Diego, did you want to say anything? Is maybe Diego is not there, or hang on, let me just make sure if he's there. No, he's not there. Okay, Alison, please respond. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I just want to say that I think most of us have had the opportunity to visit Caracas. Some of us have had the opportunity to leave Caracas to visit other parts of Venezuela during elections observers, delegations, or conferences. So I think that the internationalism that we observe permeates through Venezuelan society. There are neighborhoods that are definitely plastered with beautiful murals. And I think it's important to say that that is not only in Caracas that we see those or see, Viva Palestina. If you look online at mobilizations for Palestine, they take place in different cities and different parts of Venezuela, of course, concentrated in Caracas. But by contrast, we can do a mural here in Vancouver, Canada. We find a place, but it's under constant threat of vandalization, of being taken down. And I think a testament to Venezuelans' internationalism is that the murals, are often untouched. They're clean. They're, if something happens, people mobilize to fix it. And I think that's, in a way, a mural is more than a mural. It's a symbol of people's dedication to a cause. And I just wanted to say that I think part of this internationalism and the way that it's permeated is through, of course, the political education that people have undergone in the Bolivarian revolutionary process, and also the development of media such as Telesur. I mean, imagine 25 years ago, there was no Telesur, there was no anti-imperialist central media in Latin America. Many other websites now exist beyond that, but our struggles sometimes ends up also taking place in social media and online, and we now have resources like Telesur and others to speak about anti-imperialism or internationalism, and those are supported by Venezuela's Bolivarian revolutionary process. We haven't talked a lot today, but about the actual election of the National Assembly, but I wanted to mention that internationalists, revolutionary internationalists, and activists were elected in Venezuela's National Assembly election. It's a very different election in that aspect as well. For example, we have a young woman named Albaniz Montilla, who is an activist in the communes movement, who has been living in Mexico and has been central to building Palestine solidarity in Mexico in the student movement. She's now an elected member of Venezuela's National Assembly at, I believe, 27 years old. So I think that definitely revolutionary internationalism has been a profound change in Venezuela. It's really something that is incredible to observe. And like visiting Cuba, you often find yourself in very political discussions, with everyday people on the street, including your taxi driver, the person that you're talking to buying a piece of, some food on the street, because society has been politicized through this Bolivarian revolutionary process in a way that we often don't encounter in places like Canada or the United States.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. I think there being no further questions, I'm going to bring this absolutely, and that we also touching our 2-hour mark. So I should like to bring this wonderful webinar to an end. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to you all for turning up. I'd also like to remind you that Carlos has put in the chat the next Venezuela International Manifesto Group meeting, which is going to be about Gabriel Roquel, about Domenico Losurdo's book, criticizing Western Marxism, which will feature speakers including Gabriel Roquel and Jennifer Ponce de Leon, both of whom have played a very important role in bringing Losurdo's book to light. And other speakers, let me see. Other speakers include Alex Gordon, chair of the Marx Memorial Library, and of course, Carlos himself, and it will be chaired by Francisco Dominguez. So please tune in. It'll be a hybrid event, partly in person at the Marx Memorial Library in London, and partly by Zoom. So please tune in. Please circulate the information, because it's really part of the same struggle. It's, if we are going to be an anti-imperialist left in the world, a very large part of the work has to be to criticize some of the limitations of the Western left in particular on issues of imperialism. So I hope you will all join us. Thank you again very much, and good night or good afternoon, depending on where you are, or good morning even. And yeah, see you next time. Thank you very much. Save the chat. Carlos, if you can, please save the chat and the transcript. I will leave.